We'll be sharing with you some history, some prophecy, and some probably personal and relevant stories. And we'd like you to sit back, relax. We're going to do all the work for you. And we're going to actually start today with a video that we've had especially made just for today. The people who've put it together have done a wonderful job. So we're going to start off by showing you that. It runs for 13 minutes, after which we're going to have a brief interview with a friend of mine, Russell, who I'll introduce you to in a little bit. So for now, sit back, relax, and watch our wonderful video.
The nation of Israel is experiencing a dramatic renaissance never before seen in human history. In a land that was barren for nearly 2,000 years, life is bursting forth. Acres of vineyards and olive groves are transforming rocky mountains. From every nation on earth, Christian tourists are coming here by the millions, fulfilling their dreams of walking in the very places where their Savior walked. And most miraculously of all, Israel is once again becoming the home of the once scattered Jewish people. Over the last century, they have returned here by the millions, from the north, south, east, and west. We are living in the times spoken about long ago, the time that this nation would be reborn.
Herzl realized that the only solution to anti-Semitism was for the Jews to have their own state. By 1914, there were nearly 100,000 Jews living in Palestine. They had started 50 agricultural villages and farmed roughly 100,000 acres of land.
His Majesty's government views with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people.
After the American, British, and Allied forces defeated the Germans, hundreds of thousands of Jews came to Palestine, and the UN General Assembly passed a fateful plan to divide up Palestine into independent Arab and Jewish states.
Abstain.
As the roll call began, the proceedings were momentarily interrupted. A piercing cry came from the gallery. Ana Adonai Hoshiana. O Lord, please save us.
The United States? Yes. Yemen? No.
The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
The stage was set. On the afternoon of May 14th, several council members met to approve the final draft of the declaration. The text was approved unanimously, but just hours before it would be read, the new state still didn't have a name. Historical names like Zion and Judea were proposed and rejected. It was Ben-Gurion who decided that the name would be simply Medinat Israel, the State of Israel. Despite the instructions for secrecy, the news had leaked out, and a large crowd gathered outside the museum. Jewish leaders were now racing the sunset to finish the ceremony before the Sabbath began at 5 o'clock. At 4 p.m., David Ben-Gurion called the meeting to order. The crowd rose and sang Hatikvah. Then Ben-Gurion read the declaration aloud.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית. תוקף זכותנו הטבעית וההיסטורית ועל יסוד החלטת עצרת האומות המאוחדות אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
President Truman recognized the new state of Israel just 11 minutes after the British mandate officially ended.
The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
He was cheering in the streets. It was a big thing, dancing in the streets and all this. And he was standing in the back there. He says, what the people are dancing here, what they don't know is tomorrow we've got a war.
It wasn't long before Ben-Gurion was proven right. In the Declaration of Independence, he had offered the Arabs an equal place in the new state. But that night, his olive branch was answered by the roar of Egyptian warplanes. At 1 minute past midnight, they bombed the city of Tel Aviv. And at dawn, tanks from 5 Arab armies rolled into the new state of Israel. A year later, in 1949, all sides had grown weary of fighting. Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria signed armistice agreements with Israel. The Jewish state had survived the first of many challenges to her existence.
At a meeting ending in the early hours of the morning, Defense Minister Dayan told the cabinet that only through a preemptive strike could Israel stand up to the Arab armies now massed along its borders. That strike, he added, must take place sooner rather than later. He then laid out the battle plan devised by the country's top military minds. The attack order was radioed from the Defense Ministry in Tel Aviv. Israeli planes took off at staggered intervals, heading for key Egyptian bases in the Sinai, the Suez, and Nile Valley. In just 7 minutes, the Israeli Air Force destroyed the Egyptian planes before moving on to rocket bomb enemy airfields. From the Temple Mount, the paratroopers sprinted to the western wall to clear it of snipers. There were serious casualties, but in minutes the battle was over. For the first time in 2,000 years, the old city of Jerusalem was in Jewish hands. And for many, it was a moment that was almost impossible to fathom.
Israel becomes increasingly in the world, there will be those who stand up for Israel with the faith and integrity of Abraham, and they will make all the difference.
Israel was founded 3 years after the Holocaust. 3 years after 70% of the Jews were destroyed in what is exponentially the largest slaughter of any people in human history, the remnant trickled back against the will of the British, with no support from the world, into a desert piece of real estate with no natural resources, no infrastructure, surrounded by millions of hostile Arabs in a constant state of warfare, terrorism, economic blockade. And think about it, within a few years, the desert is exporting fruits and vegetables to the rest of the world. But Israel is the only country in the world that has more trees at the end of the 20th century than the beginning. In terms of high-tech per capita, the most in the world is in Israel, done in less than 40 years, with no natural resources, constant war, terrorism, economic blockade. It's unbelievable. But people just don't see it because we've gotten used to it. It's Jewish history. It's all supernatural.
I think I'm privileged to have grown up in a land where my grandfather, where his parents, where his forefathers only dreamed of living one day, of seeing built one day. This is home, and home is where you want to be.
Well, that was inspirational, wasn't it? It was something that has given us a bit of extra background there, and we've been able to see what an incredible way this small country has come in such a short time. Well, to help us this afternoon sort of look at some of these things and flesh out some of the amazing things that have happened in the state of Israel, and that it has not only happened, but that it has lasted a full 70 years now since these things have come to pass. So to help me flesh out some of these things and discuss them this afternoon, I've asked my friend, Mr. Russell Kirkwood, to come forward and help us. Russell, as we've seen there on that introductory video, this little country has just been through so much. I mean, you know, it went through a war of independence, 1956, was it Suez Crisis? The Six-Day War of 1967, Yom Kippur War, 1973. Well, we keep going. 1980s Lebanon War, 1990s missiles landing on Israel from Iraq.
Yep.
We're sitting here in Australia, but isn't this the lucky country?
Lucky. It's an interesting term to use when you speak of Israel. I don't know whether the people living there would actually use that term, or Jews down through the ages, whether they would consider themselves lucky given their amazing history. But however, yeah, it's an amazing country. It's survived all of these crises. They've certainly grown used to things that we would be shocked and horrified happening in and around our country. And yet they have managed to live and prosper in a way in Israel which is quite remarkable given the circumstances.
So we wouldn't call it lucky.
I don't think luck is it's a really bad term to call Israel lucky. More like it's been chosen. I'd like to say chosen
yeah.
would be more like it.
What's it mean to be chosen? I mean, some people might have a certain idea on that one way, but is there a chosen people? It's not something that we deal with in our everyday life.
No, it's an unusual way of looking at things. And basically, when you talk about the nation of Israel, for most people, they're thinking about the biblical stories. You're thinking about the Disney, the Prince of Egypt, things like this. That people are thinking, this is a nation which is at the very heart of the Christian Bible, and yet there are many more things. In fact, the Bible is made up of a great deal of prophecy, and a lot of that prophecy involves Israel.
So the Bible is not just full of Bible stories, it's actually which tell about things that happened in the past. It's prophecy, isn't that things about the future?
Yeah, the amazing thing is that prophecies in the Bible were not just for our time or into the future from here, but often the prophecies were to the people living at that time for things that would happen in the near future. And so if you're reading through the Bible, you will often find the word prophecy used, and often the Bible actually tells you what the prophecy is actually doing and how it will be fulfilled. It's quite a remarkable book in this way.
So it's not like Nostradamus where they're a little bit vague and you have to work it out yourself?
No, not always. There can be some difficult prophecies to understand, but there's others that are very, very clear. And we saw a few on the short video that we had just before. So basically there's a lot of prophecy in and around the nation of Israel.
So when you see an example, like you said, of a prophecy on the screen there that we saw in the video, and you being somebody who's very much interested in this sort of thing, what kind of what particular prophecy do you like to go to first? What do you think is really leads the way in your thinking?
Well, it's basically a smorgasbord, okay, right, when it comes to the Bible. Let's have a look at one to start with, which is a bit of an example, and it came up on the video there before. It's from one of the smaller books of the Bible called Amos, and it's in Amos chapter 9. So Amos chapter 9 is a really interesting kind of part of the Bible. Now, Amos was a prophet to the northern tribes of Israel, and the 10 northern tribes. Israel was at one stage split into two nations, Judah and the northern tribes of Israel, or Samaria, it has various names. And he was a prophet who actually prophesied to the northern kingdoms. And so, it mentions in Amos chapter 9, if I can actually find it, quite an interesting verse here. It says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that the ploughman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes him that soweth seed. And the mountain shall drop as sweet wine, and all the hills shall melt. And I will bring again the captivity of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities, and inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards, and drink wine thereof, and they shall also make gardens, and eat the fruit of them. And I will plant them upon their land, and they shall no more be pulled out of their land, which I have given them, saith the Lord thy God. Now that's an interesting statement. No more, whether he's going to pull them out of the land. Now, it sort of means that he's talking about the recent history, because as we know that Israel...
What do you mean by recent?
More recent than... Well, I was born in 1971. Israel existed. Most of the people in this room were born into a world where Israel existed.
Right.
Some of the people may not have been. I know my mother was born into a world where there was no Israel. And so recent history for me is my lifetime. However, the 20th century was an amazing period of history which brought about two amazing and devastating wars, the result of which freed up a space for the nation of Israel.
So you're saying that those wars made it possible?
Quite.
I mean, there's a lot of people. That's a big statement. A lot of people died just so.
Well, it's one of the outcomes of those wars. We saw on the video just before the charge of the Light Horse Brigade, which Australian troops took place in the Battle of Beersheba, and that was what cleared the Turkish resistance out of Israel and allowed the British in there and to take Jerusalem in I think it was 1917 towards the very end of the war. So that hadn't been achieved right until the end of World War I, and that really opened the way for greater waves of settlers to come back to the land of Israel. There was a few in the land at that time. I think they only numbered 100,000 or so. But then after that happened, there was a lot more immigration.
Right. And, I mean, you've cited one particular passage there, interesting one, for us. I mean, I doubt there's many skeptics in the room, but how do you know it's God that's done it just because he said it? Maybe he said it and the people, they went and did it or something.
So you could argue that it was a construct that was created by Christian people who facilitated the Jews to come back to the land. That would be one. I've heard that put forward, and we see that happening today with the likes of the Trump administration and this, where there are a great many Christians who have risen into a position of power and may be influencing events. But to put forward the concept that the outcomes of First World War and the Second World War were a construct purely designed to bring about the nation of Israel is a preposterous thing to say. And it basically, when you look back in hindsight, which hindsight is a wonderful thing and in many ways corrupts the history of the time, but to do that, you look back and you see that one of the great outcomes of World War I was the freeing up of the then nation, the then area of Palestine, which hadn't been inhabited by the Jews in any numbers for 1900 years. In fact, they'd been thrown out of the land after 70 CE, and basically in 135 CE, the Emperor Hadrian had banned all Jews from coming in anywhere near Jerusalem apart from one day of the year, which was to celebrate the destruction of that city. So it's
how magnanimous of him.
Yeah, he's very nice person, Hadrian. But he despised the Jews. They'd been such a terrible problem to him, and he decided to rid the land completely of them. Right. And basically, from that period on, up until the late 1880s, there were no Jews living in Israel.
No. So there was not even that remnant. There was just a few, but nothing.
There may have been a smattering of them, but of no significance. And the fact was, they didn't own land. Yeah. It wasn't their country. They weren't able to. They weren't even able to buy it.
Yeah. Now, what in particular would you say binds this particular people so closely to that particular land? I mean, here we, buy and sell property and doesn't really worry us if we move house or whatever. How do the Jews and the Israelis see, how do they connect with the land? Well, what's this big thing about them and the land? It could be any land, couldn't it?
Yeah, actually, they take this very, very seriously, and you may well have heard about the patriarch of that nation, which was Abraham, and God gave promises which are recorded in Genesis chapter 12 and in other places in the early part of the Bible.
So were those promises? Were they prophecy as well?
Well, they are as a matter. They have many things in them. It was prophesied that they would be taken into, that they would go down to Egypt and they would become a great nation. I think that's in Genesis chapter 15. There were all these promises made to Abraham that he would become a father of a great nation. And so what we see today is a great nation. We've got 6.5 million Jewish people living in the land of Israel. The nation of Israel represents about 8.5 million people. The projected growth figures on this country are astonishing. It has one of the highest birth rates in the OECD countries. And, you know, we're talking about a country that has a projected sort of population of around 35 million by 2050.
Grow the land.
Well, it's going to get very, very busy there. Definitely going to get very busy in Israel.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in terms of the land itself, I mean, they seem to have done so much with it. Do you think that they act on the land or deal with the land because it's part of promise, part of prophecy, or just because they want to be somewhere?
Well, it's very interesting that you know, if you have a look at a survey of what the demographics of the country, such as Israel, compared to say the demographics of Australia, it's quite surprising to find that in Israel, 80% of the population believes in God, versus Australia, where we've got a nominally Christian population of around about 52%. And so, you know, in many ways, we view Israel as a nation which you know, is basically sectarian in its nature. However, when it comes down to tin tacks, there's a lot of people in Israel who believe that there is a God, and they have very good reason for that.
Such as?
They look through their history, which it's a frightening history looking back into time. They've been persecuted down through the ages. They've been murdered by the millions in a way that you know, we've rarely seen on this planet before. A systematic attempt to make them extinct, and they've survived through this and so many other challenges. And then at the, you know, in the midpoint of the 20th century, they came into their own as a nation in one day, as we saw before.
One day. I mean, as you mentioned there, they've been through quite a lot. And you were talking earlier that them being where they are now is because of prophecy and is because of God's hand, you would say. Did millions of people really have to die to get to that point? I mean,
well, you know
what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. That is the challenging question. As Christians, we view God in a context of a loving and faithful God, and yet, you know, when we look at the nation of Israel, they have certainly seen the severity of God in the way that they have been treated through the centuries since the Romans threw them out of the land at the beginning of the Christian era.
Okay. Now, what is? Would you say that because that has made them more spiritual as a nation, that there's so many people of their own that have not survived, that they are become more spiritual, or do they tend to be more secular? And I mean, who cares?
Yeah, well, basically, looking at the demographics once again, you've got about 8.5% of the nation of Israel who are ultra-Orthodox.
High?
Yes, it's high and growing by the day. It's actually one of the fastest growing parts of the country. And so this ultra-Orthodox Judaism is a bit of a real problem for them in their society, which is described as a society based around the principles of pluralism, which is basically, you know, you've got all these various parties which interact to form government. But as this sector of the country gets stronger and stronger, it creates problems for the whole country as a governing body.
Yeah. Now, I just want to take if there's anybody in the audience who has a question, just raise your hand. I'll come to that in a moment. Before we do that, Russell, where do you think these prophecies are going, really? I mean, is this all going to be about the past?
Well, it's interesting because the best way to look at prophecy is in hindsight. Prophecy is a very difficult thing. It's not an exact science to foretell the future.
Hindsight is prophecy's strong point, isn't it?
It certainly is. Yeah, definitely. But in Israel, we have so many clear-cut prophecies which were telling us how Israel would come back to the land, that we can view these things now very, very clearly. And see from that, the hand of God has been very strong in this. When I say that, the hand of God, what do I really mean? The circumstances, the timing, the way that things happen have worked in a way that enabled Israel to return to the land. The events of, say, World War II, which forced a vast amount of the Jewish population into basically be refugees, made sure that they wouldn't necessarily return to Europe in the same way. It created an enormous problem for the nations what to do with this Jewish problem that they were left with, both before the war and after the war, and from that the nucleus of that nation of Israel was formed. And as we saw on the video before, the monumentous events that took place around 1947 and 48, which brought into being this small nation, which amazingly was called the State of Israel. Which harks back to so many prophecies, and possibly we looked a little bit there at one of the key prophecies that is one of the clearest parts of the Bible is Ezekiel 37, which talks about this analogy of this valley of dry bones, which comes to life, has flesh put on it, and God then breathes into it. And then the people stand up onto their feet and become a great nation. Is this another one of those examples that you say is? I think you said it was circumstance, situation, and timing. Yes, definitely. Is this a part of that as well? Yeah, it's a great prophecy, and one of the things that I find amazing in this part of the Bible, in Ezekiel 37, is that you can actually trace yourself into this prophecy. You can put a time. What do you mean by that? Explain that for us. No problems. So as you're reading through Ezekiel 37, there's the prophecy to the dry bones, which takes up to about verse 14, and it says, "And I shall put my spirit," in verse 14, "I shall put my spirit in you, and you shall live, and I shall place you in your own land, and then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken it and performed it, saith the Lord." So in other words, when you see Israel back in their land, the result is that when you're reading this, you say, God did that. Right? Now that happened just prior to my birth. Most of these events did. I've watched Israel right through my life. I've been reading the Bible and looking at these prophecies. And as I read towards this prophecy, it doesn't just stop there. It continues on. So you get down to verse 22 and it says, "I will make them one nation in the land and upon the mountains of Israel. And one king shall rule over them." Now hang on a minute, just stop right there. Everything's fulfilled to verse 22, but there's one problem. Well, David's coming back. Well, where's the king? No, there's no king in Israel. No. It runs on a parliamentary democracy, very similar to Australia. Mm-hmm. They have a prime minister. Does he think he's a king? Well, he likes to at the moment, but he certainly is not a king. And yet we look at the land of Israel and we look at their symbolism and even their flag, which speaks of the line of David, which is kingly, and the two blue lines represent the priesthood. And we see a country which is, asking for a king. Amazing. Right. How do you think they view the king at the moment? Is that part of? I mean, the land is all around them, and they can work that. They can do something about it. The king. Well, where are we going with that? Well, it would be very different speaking to an ultra-Orthodox Jew rather than a Jew that doesn't necessarily believe in God. In many ways, the Jewish nation is a very proud nation. They have one of the eighth strongest defence force in the world. The eighth, which for such a tiny country is quite amazing. They are a very, very strong country. Obviously, they've never really confirmed it, but we know that they have nuclear weapons. And so they are a very powerful and a proud people. And for good reason, they live in a very difficult neighbourhood. And so, you certainly would want to be protecting your citizens, given the people and the ideologies which live around them. Right.
I've actually got two questions here, but what makes you confident that the Bible has more answers for Israel's future? I mean, it's an old book, maybe it's run out of steam, it's got to the people back to their land. Is there anything
it's interesting.
left is there any more juice in those prophecies?
Oh, absolutely. So we've spoken mostly about the Old Testament. In fact, I think there was one reference in the video to Luke 21.
I seem to recall
which was in there. But one of the most compelling parts of the New Testament is in the very first chapter of Acts. And this is the apostles, or the disciples at this stage, and they were speaking with the resurrected Jesus, which would be a very great place to be speaking to someone. And I'll just read you what they say. And being assembled together with them, in Acts chapter 1 at verse 4, together with them, commanded them that they should not depart from Jerusalem. This is Jesus speaking now, but wait for the promise of the Father, which he said, "Ye have heard of me." Right, so it's Jesus speaking to them, and then it says, "And when they therefore were come together," in verse 6, "they asked of him, saying, Lord, wilt thou at this time restore again the kingdom of Israel?"
Well, why are they asking him?
They were asking him because they believed that he was the king.
Right.
And his answer to them is that it's not for you to know the times of the seasons which the Father has put in his own power. And then it talks about they're receiving the Holy Spirit. They'll go out, they'll preach all around the world before this happens. And so that was quite a long time ago now. The gospel has been extended around the globe to places they didn't even know existed at this point. And now we're in a situation, thanks to the internet and various other technological advances, where there's not many people left on this planet who haven't heard the gospel, and yet Jesus has not returned.
Yeah.
And he has not set up a kingdom in Israel, and that is the most important fact here.
So is this relevant to us as well, or are the Jews waiting for their king? How do they know, or how do we know that king would be Jesus anyway?
See, the Bible's very clear, and the message of the kingdom of God is a key fundamental message in the gospel.
I think I've heard that one, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
And so, Christians are looking for this kingdom, a kingdom with Jesus as the king.
Right.
And the forerunner to that kingdom, when you view the Old Testament prophecies, is the nation of Israel. It seems to be the crucial link that this happens before Jesus returns to the earth.
Right. And just bringing that back to us and relevancy for us, is there anything we need to do about that, or think of, these are prophecies, the book's got a couple of covers, we can close it. Is that end of the story?
I think it is. People tend to turn off with the word prophecy. They think Harry Potter, spooky, weird stuff.
Yeah.
However, prophecy is to be seen right throughout the Bible. As I said before, the Bible contains a large amount of prophecy, some which is very relevant to us, and some which has taken place in the past. But it's an amazing book, and I was in looking at various things in relation to this presentation today. I noted that the Dead Sea Scrolls were found at the very time that the nation of Israel was declaring independence, and those scrolls contained a full record of books such as Jeremiah and Isaiah. And so those particular parts of the Bible are rich in prophecies about Israel returning to the land, and rich in the way that God would bless them when they've turned up there. And what we've seen in Israel is not just them coming back to the land and blundering along.
This is all more timing.
Oh, absolutely. They haven't blundered along in the land. That land is amazing. It has grown in 70 years. Once again, we saw someone on the video, putting this out, saying, look at what's happened in 70 years in this country.
Right.
It has gone from being basically a place where there wasn't a paved road to being a modern and amazing economy. And most of that time it's spent without any great natural resources.
Yep.
More recently, there's been gas and oil discoveries in Israel, which will add fuel to the fire of their economic prosperity.
Sure. Well, thank you, Russell. You've been very informative. Thank you, audience, for listening to what I've sure you found this fascinating, and we will now open up for any questions anybody has. We have one from the gentleman at the back here. Okay, so the question was, Russell, why doesn't the Bible talk about other countries who have made some progress in some areas, say building highways faster or building other things faster? Why are these other countries not in the Bible?
Well, so the Bible is mostly concerned with the nation of Israel. It doesn't really look broadly at many other nations. It's a book which was given effectively to the nation by Moses when they were in the wilderness wanderings. The prophets that are written about there, we referred to Amos and various other prophets, Jeremiah and Isaiah, were prophets to the nation of Israel. The New Testament was based in Israel. It's only after Acts chapter 1 that the Bible really takes a great focus outside of Israel. It does actually leave Israel a couple of times when Israel are taken into captivity in Babylon, but primarily it is focused in the nation of Israel.
Moses was in Egypt too.
He was in Egypt, but it's still concerned with the nation of Israel. It's unlikely that you'll find many prophecies about other nations, though there are other nations mentioned in that book. Economic growth. Israel, at the time when the vote of independence or the statement of independence was had a population of around 640,000, and that has grown to 6.5 million Jews since that point. So we're coming off much less of a base than somewhere like China, which has been inhabited for a continuous amount of time by the Chinese, and is also one of the most prosperous places in the world due to its geographic location, the soil, all kinds of things. We're talking about in Israel a land which was destroyed by war. The writer Mark Twain in 1860 travelled around on one of his junkets around Israel and said it was the most barren and desolate land where they could not even find a tree.
Yeah, right.
Okay, this is a barren, desolate and broken land.
Well, as I think they said in the video that they have there was more trees in Israel at the end of the
remarkable.
Than end of the century than there was at the start of the century.
Yeah, it's a remarkable country in that.
Well, I don't know if we can say that about Australia.
No, definitely not.
Any other questions? We have one from a gentleman. Okay, so the question, Russell, was, sorry, I'm just relaying it because we didn't have a microphone down there. Why these promises? Why are they relevant to people other than Israel?
Oh, that's a great question. So obviously, if you go back to Genesis, where the promises were given to Abraham, it says that his children would be blessed, and that through them a blessing would flow to all nations.
Right.
And so it's only really in the New Testament where that is further expanded to us by the work of some people like Paul, who explained these things in great detail of how Jesus was that. He basically was that person who was going to bless all nations. And as we mentioned before in Acts chapter 1, the gospel had to be preached through all nations before Israel had a king again. Now Israel hasn't had a king since the time of the Babylonians, when they came and took away the last king of Israel. And now Israel has not had a king since that time. And so we're talking there about setting up a kingdom again, and that is quite a remarkable thing.
So is that relevant, answering the question, how is that relevant to people who are not in the land or not Jews or not?
Absolutely, and in the New Testament, particularly in Romans, Paul talks about what makes up a Jew and how are people. What is a Jew? Okay, what makes up that person?
Right.
And so through the New Testament scriptures, we understand that by believing in Jesus Christ and by being baptized, we basically can come into these promises that were given to Abraham. The book of Galatians refers to how those promises came down to people who are not Jews.
Right.
People such as myself, who would be referred to in the Bible as Gentile believers.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Russell, and thank you for joining us, everybody, today. We've got some refreshments at the back for you to help yourself to, and there's also some information bags you're welcome to take with you as well. If you'd just join me in thanking Russell for being with us today. And you're welcome to join us again for our next session, and we look forward to seeing you again, Russell.
Cheers.